I think we can start the session 4. For session 4, we have Professor Ricardo Reis, or I used to pronounce Reis, which sounds easier to me, but I'm sorry, from LSE to talk about the paper on conventional and unconventional monetary policies, inflation, and resources.
Great,
Professor
thank you
Reis.
so much. So thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. Now, I was asked a somewhat unconventional request, which was to discuss unconventional policy in this conference, using a framework in a paper I wrote 7 years ago to think about conventional policies and how they work. So here's how I'm going to address it, and for the next 30 minutes, to give you a roadmap of what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to quite quickly, over 5 to 10 minutes, to give you that framework on how to think about what is a conventional way a central bank works in terms of controlling inflation. I will rush through that. The reason why the slides, there's far too many slides, so that you have the details and you can see the version of it that I will use. I will then spend 10 minutes talking about unconventional policies, and in that context, what are their pros and cons. And then, and as a reaction to the discussion an hour ago, I was going to spend 2 minutes, but instead I'm going to spend 10 minutes talking about some topics that Mark has raised on remuneration of reserves in this context, and partly because I have a paper on that, a recent paper with Syed Husseini on discussing some of these issues. So hopefully I'll answer certainly some of the issues that Thomas, Isabel raised, as well as I think, well, someone else raised. But as we go along, I'll try to answer some of those. So that's the plan. So on that, let me start with the more boring, if you want, just how does a conventional central bank work? Here's a simple analytical framework to make sense of the different bits that will allow me to frame the discussion of the other things. I'm going to use the minimal economic model I need to think about prices and inflation. And that minimal model is a model that has one equation only that reflects the optimal behavior of private agents in an economy. If we have an asset J that pays some interest, some return, and given that that return is nominal in yen, I need to look at what's happening to the price of yen in terms of goods, the price level, to get the real return. Then agents will want to hold this real return insofar as its expected discounted value of this return is exactly equal to 1, where M is the classic stochastic discount factor that many of us learned from John's book. On top of it, if that asset is not a pure financial asset in the sense that it doesn't just give you a financial return, but also give you some liquidity, utility, transactions benefit, it's going to earn a convenience yield, which I'm going to call here Q. So if you have a pure financial asset, the classic ones where Q is 0, think about, for instance, a pure nominal bond, that is 0. This interest rate was given a period before, and that is the pricing equation for a nominal bond. For a real bond, a pure real bond, again, this is gone, and this would be just 1 plus R, which would be, as well known, the inverse of the expected discount factor. But if you have, for instance, money, an asset, that would pay 0 interest, but this Q would be a function that declines on the amount of money, and this is what you would call the money demand function, which you've written many times. This would be the standard money demand function. Why is this a minimal model? Because I'm going to take as given the real variables, the convenience yield, stochastic discount factor, and solve for the nominal variables. You may call this a partial equilibrium. You may call this a nominal equilibrium. Take as given real to solve for nominal. In a model with a classical dichotomy, that would actually be consistent. That's the idea of the classical dichotomy. But even in a model with any nominal rigidities, you can say, given real, let's pin down nominal. Of course, that pinning down nominal may then feed back into the real, but you can always ask this question, and this question I'm going to ask. On top of it, I'm going to have that all uncertainty is going to be realized in the first period. It's going to be period 0, period 1 and onwards. There's no uncertainty for period 1 onwards, so I'm going to talk about period 0 as the short run, and period 1 as the long run. And that's just going to be a way to get rid of infinite sums and to think about it more simply. So, then, crucially, what is a central bank? Central bank has 2 liabilities. One is reserves, the ultimate form of payment in digital economy in which payments are settled, which are nothing but entries in the spreadsheet of a central bank. Key about reserves that the central bank chooses both their quantity, V, and the remuneration, I, and I'm going to take the conventional modern times in which the central bank has supplied enough of these that the convenience yield is gone to 0. In other words, that, therefore, as a result of that equation, if the convenience yield reserves has gone to 0 and we promise an interest rate, it must follow that the interest on reserves is equal to the interest on the short-term bonds. for this equation holding to those two. So reserves, you choose their quantity, you choose their remuneration. If you supply them in an abundant way, you're pinning down the short-term rate as well. Banknotes, the other liability, are different insofar as, one, they provide some utility and privacy, people enjoying physical payments of some form, and we have never ever satiated the demand for them. So that convenience yield exists, and again, takes the form of a standard, if you want, money demand function, where this is velocity and this is a shock. Moreover, currency pays no interest. Its interest rate on this currency is 0. So the central bank really chooses the quantity of the banknotes. Unlike reserves, does not choose their interest. It cannot. Unlike reserves, we have never satiated the world with banknotes. We've never driven that interest rate. That would imply driving the interest rate to close to 0. Or I should say we have never, but we have. But anyway, but in principle, we don't, and I'm going to drive that distinction for now. On the assets, the central bank can buy all kinds of assets, all kinds of a rich portfolio, where this is its real value. And then it's going to be a net worth. I'm going to define the net worth net without the currency. So that's going to be the assets minus the reserves. You could also include the currency if you want, but it's going to be useful for me to do it that way. Because then the no Ponzi scheme condition, the balance sheet, the solvency of the central bank is that its initial net worth is going to be equal to the expected present value of whatever surpluses it has. Were it not to be, reserves would be running a Ponzi scheme, the central bank would be insolvent. So the last thing is, what is the surplus of the central bank? Well, a central bank issues currency on which it earns seigniorage revenues, the change in H divided by P. But on top of it, the central bank pays a dividend to the fiscal authority, has some expenses in this building and paying for the electricity bills. And finally, it's going to earn the interest on its portfolio of bonds, which is going to depend on essentially how the interest on reserves compares with the interest that it's earned on the different assets which is involved. So the central bank, conventional central bank, is choosing the quantity of interest on reserves, chooses the quantity of banknotes, chooses the composition of its balance sheet, and maybe can choose even a little bit of its expenses in that nominal equilibrium with the inflation outcomes that result, as well as whatever is the dividend that it gives to the fiscal authority. In this context, what is conventional monetary policy? Let's think of conventional monetary policy as setting a feedback rule on the interest on reserves, where X is a policy choice and phi is a parameter. Combine that feedback rule with that pricing condition as it applies to real bonds and as they compare with the reserves, you get the standard Fisher equation. These two equations under these two conditions give you the solution for the initial price level and the inflation from period 1 onwards. There's only two things to solve for, date 0 and date 1 onwards, and I write the date 1 as the inflation from 1 onwards. And they're just equal to whatever happened to the real economy, which again, I'm taking as given. It's okay if it's not. And the choice of the monetary policy, which is the excess here. That is the conventional way we think of monetary policy holding. Note that this right away makes sense of the job of central bank economists as a whole, in terms of these very two simple equations. What do central bank economists do? Well, we solve optimal policies to figure out what the optimal inflation is that we'd like to be in. It doesn't need to be 2% because in the short run, we want to deviate from it as you trade off with different goals. You measure the state of the economy. You have 100 PhD economists measuring the state of the economy. Well, that's basically the statistic here is just R hat. This unobserved state of the economy is nothing but what the real, you called it sometimes the neutral rate. Third, you implement a decision. How do you achieve the target given your estimate of R hat? You set X hat equals to R hat minus phi minus 1 the pi hat star. That's the whole implementation. Monetary policy committees, different views on where the state of the economy is, what the desired inflation is today. And finally, and not negligent, not irrelevant, you do transparency communication. Why is transparency communication so important? Because if you look at whether you're near the target, it doesn't depend only whether P0 is close to the P0 star. It depends not just on what you set, but what people expect the reality to be relative to what you set. If you are able to steer people's expectations towards your own expectations, that itself leads to inflation being closer to target. And so transparency communication of how you got to your X's and how you got to your R's ends up being as important as it is to measure the state of the economy, implementing the decision, or figuring out the optimal target. So here's a very simple way to capture, I think, a lot of what a central bank does in terms of very simple sufficient statistics. Now, what happens to the other tools then, in terms of, I think, what I would say is a conventional central bank? Well, the size of the balance sheet, as long as you're satiated, so that you can implement interest on reserves, is somewhat irrelevant, so you might as well keep it small. Banknotes, well, once you've chosen an interest rate and a price has resulted, you're going to supply the banknotes that are demanded. It's entirely driven by the demand function, and the demand function, again, follows from the equation with a convenience yield for it. Assets, again, to first approximation, are irrelevant. Might as well keep them in one-period bonds. And finally, if you distribute all your surpluses as dividends, then you're going to be keeping your net worth constant, and the fiscal result is that the dividends are just going to be seigniorage from banknotes minus the expenses. And this, I would argue, is roughly what a conventional central bank does and how it all fits together. 3 clarifications to start with. The particular shape of the feedback rule is not important for this general framework. You can work through many. John Taylor's version, Athanasios Orphanides was talking about growth rules a little while. They all translate to just phi being large enough. So number one principle of the conventional monetary policy, you have to be aggressive enough in how you change interest rates to inflation. Whether that's above 1, 1.5, 2, it's going to depend on exactly the shape of the rule. Second, the terminal condition. Remember, I had 2 conditions for this to hold. This terminal condition, that says that inflation will not rise more than exponentially fast away from target. How do you implement that? You have to have in the words of the ECB, a monetary pillar, an escape clause that says that if inflation was going way out of hand, you wouldn't just be doing the feedback rule of raising interest rates even faster than inflation, but rather you would transition to fixing the money supply. That will pin down that would pin down the terminal condition. And finally, third, that linearizations are not particularly important. You can do everything in a nonlinear term. But you have to be aggressive enough, and you have to have an escape clause, a pillar, something to anchor the expectations, which a Taylor rule won't do by itself. So, with that in mind, let's now discuss unconventional monetary policy, as I was asked to do. First form of unconventional monetary policy, one that's, I think, may be sometimes forgotten, but it's actually a fundamental one. The most common form of unconventional monetary policy in the history of central banks in the last 100 years and more is when the Treasury tells you, I don't want interest rates to get much higher because I don't like paying interest on my bonds. That puts an upper bound on the interest rate that the central bank can raise. In the case of the Federal Reserve, that was Federal Reserve between 1940 and 1951, before the Fed Treasury Accord. You could not raise interest rates above a level set by the Treasury. What that means is that the feedback rule now has a max. As that feedback rule now has a max, you can only set the interest rate, you can't set the interest rate above that number. What happens is that when you combine those 2 equations, and now in terms of phase diagram, the feedback rule, which had this nice slope as long as phi is bigger than 1 that pinned down this unique equilibrium, now has a horizontal segment with another equilibrium. In other words, if agents expect high inflation, because you can't raise the interest rate in the feedback rule above a certain level, you're going to justify that high inflation, and you end up with that indeterminacy, with that second equilibrium. That is the first form of a conventional monetary policy, which I see some of you smiling because you may recognize some of these equations. They're usually done the other way around, which is in terms of a lower bound. That's not unconventional policy insofar as the lower bound is a restriction of banknotes. But the logic, as it applies to, in terms of conventional policy, is what happens when you put an upper bound on interest rates. You end up with an indeterminacy. You end up with a high inflation, a steady state equilibrium. So the first unconventional monetary policy, pinning down long-term rates, being afraid of raising them, leads to a high inflation equilibrium up there. One that often is not desirable, but once you have that, even if you're trying to target that one, you cannot escape the fact that there's another steady state out there to which there's going to be a lot of movement towards it. Second form of unconventional monetary policy, what's known as forward guidance. Imagine from date 1 onwards, you are achieving your inflation target in the long run, but at date 0, the interest rate is pegged at a bound, up or lower. Let me just take that bound to be 0. For some reason, you're not moving it. And since that is 0, what happens is that you're not achieving your target. And let's say, since we're in Japan, that it's too low. Now P0 is equal to R0 plus the expected inflation tomorrow, this level tomorrow, and that doesn't happen to be your target today, the P0 star. It is not your inflation target today. Okay? In fact, it is too low. How does forward guidance work? And again, it's a very simple model, but I find it very enlightening because you can see everything with very simple math. imagine that you said that in the long run, in the medium run, let's put it, from period 1 to period t, you kept interest rates at 0. Well, what that would happen is that then your price level, your inflation, would now deviate from your target. In fact, you kept it too low, so you'd have put too high inflation for that medium run. Well, that too high inflation for the medium run, by raising the P star, raises P0. Given that you've raised this P1, and again, if you only reach that there and you've kept the interest rate at 0, that means you're going to end up with a path of prices is too high for that period. You're able to raise P0 today. What that means is that if I choose my forward guidance, I can trade off missing my target in the medium run for getting closer to my target in the short run. And that's ultimately what forward guidance is all about. Forward guidance is about I'm going to have a little bit more inflation later for getting a little bit higher inflation right now. So far, so good. What are the limitations of doing this that I think these equations show in a fairly clear way? It really relies on the promise of the future. So it relies on the rationality of the agents in the sense of their foresight. It is your promise of delivering too high inflation in the future that's leading to the high inflation today. Well, but what if the agents are confused, change their mind, form their decisions with some noise? That's going to create a lot of noise to your ability to set the inflation today. Second, and very related, is commitment. Even if they're rational, do they really believe that you're committed to delivering the high inflation in the future, that you've traded off for the high inflation today? Insofar as they not, you may end up promising and delivering a lot of inflation in the future with very little gain of inflation today because that belief never came. Or more generally, fluctuations in that are going to affect the promise of forward guidance in the future. There's also another point, one that the literature has emphasized quite a bit, maybe too much, which is that, of course, if you're deviating with some more inflation in the future in order to get more inflation in the present, the kick from the present, from the logic of the New Keynesian Phillips curve, delivers an output boom today. And so forward guidance will deliver an output boom today, which seems a little bit exaggerated in terms certainly of the mechanism we have. So forward guidance may be useful in an optimality sense. If you're at your target there and you're not at your target in the short run, by an envelope theorem argument, you'd always want to do some forward guidance in this regard, have a little bit more inflation in the medium run to get a little bit more inflation short run. But as a tool to use to replace conventional policy seems to be clearly inferior because it's relying on expectations and a commitment channel that the conventional one did much less so. In the conventional one, all you needed is to measure the state of the economy, implement a decision without any given that state, and simply communicate what you were doing. Second in conventional policy, quantitative easing. Again, let's think about this in terms of the simple model. Quantitative easing, think about it as, imagine that I had a bond, imagine that I had a nominal bond that for some reason was not paying interest, that's really for simplicity, but crucially, that bond was scarce, so it had a convenience yield, it was not a pure financial asset. Well, quantitative easing is, I'm going to exchange my reserves for the bond. By doing that, I steer the convenience yield, and even though I don't have an interest rate there, because interest rates say it's hit a peg, I can use through the quantities uses equation to, using the exact same forces, steer the economy to the inflation target. If you want, log linearizing it, this equation, to make it more simple, you can achieve your P0 now not using the interest rate, because your interest rate is pegged at 0 or it's just not working, but using instead the B0 to deliver your P0. Can you do this? Yes. What are the limitations of doing this? That again, hopefully the equations make transparent. First, what I think we've learned from QE is, for all the 50 shades or 70 shades or how many shades there are, you had to buy a lot of billions to move the equivalent interest rate by not that many tens of basis points. In other words, this eta coefficient is really small. You need a gigantic amount in order to be able to steer the price level. And that, in many ways, is uncomfortable. Second, and perhaps more important, and an old lesson that we had learned from monetarism, is that, because this is the same idea, by the way, of when we used banknotes to control inflation, is that these shocks of convenience yield are very large and very unstable. You're going to end up with a lot of volatility in inflation if you make quantitative easing your way of pinning down inflation in some way. Simply because sometimes we understand these convenience yields very little. And finally, not only they're large, they're going to be correlated with the other determinants of inflation here. And as a result, you're going to end up with a great difficulty of steering these B0 to reach them. So quantitative easing, again, is inferior to conventional monetary policy. If you don't have conventional monetary policy, clearly is a way to get a little bit of mileage, but is not a substitute for you per se. Third, we have what I'm going to call going long, to be more general than what sometimes, or what here is called YCC, or yield curve control. Imagine the central bank issues, to make it as simple as possible, issues a bill of 2-period maturity and fixes its interest rate. So the central bank now is fixing both the short-term rate and the long-term rate, if you want. Does that work? Well, actually, it does. It does, because instead of using a feedback rule, if I choose the short-term rate and the long-term rate, by the two optimality conditions, I can use the variation that across states of the world lead to a variation in the pricing of the 2-year rate to pin down inflation in this way. So yes, you can, through a yield curve control, through a going long, if you want, pin down inflation. However, that comes from, again, solving the system of two equations in two variables. And what you end up is that you have to get this just exactly right. Meaning, if you get it just slightly wrong, the consequence that you're creating an arbitrage opportunity between your 1 year and your 10 year, or your short term and your 10 year, and your balance sheet is going to move in wild amounts. This is an old insight, by the way, that comes back from the fiscal policy literature, important work by Lucas and Stoke in the 1980s, and especially by Mario Zangelettos in the early 2000s, that you can, instead of having feedback rules, you can use the maturity structure to replicate the state contingency. Problem with that is that you end up with enormously volatile positions in order to be able to achieve that. So yes, you can, but again, a very dangerous way to do it. So when it comes to unconventional policy and the BOJ's yield curve control, forward guidance, and quantitative easing, all of these are useful tools. Theory helps us understand how they work, but for all of them, when compared to the conventional monetary policy, they're all clearly inferior in ways that are easy to identify. And therefore, and again, I think what I was asked to clarify in this talk, to engage in these unconventional monetary policies when the convention is available seems to be, for the most part, dominated for the reasons that I discussed earlier. Third part, and actually, a more radical one that hasn't been done, of course, is that you could try to affect the cost of production, say through the cost of credit, even financial regulation, or affect expectations directly, what's sometimes called as communication as a policy tool. These are also unconventional monetary policies. These rely really heavily on animal spirits, your ability to steer expectations away from rationality, and the fact that you may distort real outcomes along the lines. But let me get to, from unconventional policy, now in terms of not delivering inflation, but in terms of delivering revenues, which gets us a little bit close to fiscal policy. To remind you of two unconventional monetary policies that have been adapted, they arise because sometimes the government comes to you and says, I want some dividend. I want you to generate some fiscal resources. Staying with the trim balance sheet, a central bank that is, to whom it is demanded to generate resources can only do so by generating seigniorage. And this is the classic problem studied famously by Tom Sargent and Neil Wallace, where if the central bank now has to generate some dividends, some fiscal resources, it has to generate some seigniorage. That implies some printing of banknotes. The printing of banknotes in turn implies a certain interest rate, and that interest rate implies a certain inflation. This is very hard and comes with clear limitations because not only seigniorage is an upper bound, which means that you're always chasing those dividends imposed by the fiscal authority to the point of infeasibility and hyperinflation, as well as the fact that there's very large shocks to this comment. But this is monetization, and this is something that happens to many central banks. It's very unconventional, but it happens. Another way, though, in a more modern way, is if you let, as Governor Widow was saying earlier, you could, of course, let your net worth fluctuate instead by provisioning. If you have to deliver some fiscal resources, you could use provisions, as well as the composition of your balance sheet. Those are two sides of the way Governor Widow was discussing, either through provisioning, having the WT fluctuate, or changing the composition of my assets so that sometimes I have gains and losses that affect my surplus, and in that way may affect the revenue that I have. Now, usually we tend to see this as a danger because the central banks that we have today do not generate revenues. Rather, they produce revenues as a consequence of producing their inflation target, and the revenues end up being a consequence. But of course, sometimes you are stuck with generating a D. But let me go to my third and final point, I have 5 minutes, to discuss the remuneration reserves, just following the pretext that Mark has put in his presentation. Let me frame the problem, though, a little differently from the way Mark has framed it, as what I'm going to call the Friedman and the Phelps dilemmas. Milton Friedman wrote a very important book, I think John Cochrane mentioned it in his talk, on the optimal quantity of money. And it led to a real dilemma that's well exposed actually in the biographies of Friedman by Ed Nelson and others. On the one hand, he said a central bank is a supplier of a public good, liquidity. What is the marginal cost to produce that public good? 0. Therefore, the marginal benefit following Samuelson's rule of public good provision should be 0 as well, which implies that to supply banknotes, since their interest rate is 0, the interest rate on bonds, so the opportunity cost of holding banknotes is 0, should also be 0. The Friedman rule achieving the convenience yield on currency being 0. Problem, Milton Friedman said, on the other hand, the central bank is also a monetary policy deliverer of inflation. For instance, he would favor an inflation target close to 0. Well, but how can I deliver an inflation target close to 0, say using interest rate policy or monetary policy, if the provision of the public good requires an inflation of minus the real interest rate? Well, that was a big source of insatisfaction. This was, if you want, a dilemma. Either you're a public good provisor, that means inflation of minus the real interest rate, or you're an inflation targeter, which means an inflation of 0 or 2 or 5, whatever society wants. Ned Phelps had another dilemma. Wait, hold on. If I'm providing a public good, I should be charging for it. After all, if taxation is distortionary and costly, I need to fund my public resources. I should be charging for this one just as I charge for trains or cars or any other public service that I have. I should try to, if not maximize the senior's revenue, at least have to collect some revenue out of it. Now, the Phelps dilemma is partly solved by economic theory showing that actually, insofar as banknotes are, or liquidity is an intermediate good, it may actually be optimal not to tax it under some conditions. The Friedman dilemma, in turn, was solved 10 years ago when we moved to reserves. Why? Because if I have V very large and satiate, I will satiate liquidity with respect to reserves. I will use the fact that when it comes to reserves, because I choose both the quantity and the interest rate, I can use quantity to satiate, while at the same time using the interest rate to achieve the inflation target. So I can separate and achieve the two. And we have been at the Friedman rule when it comes to reserves for 15 years. We've chosen the quantity to satiate and the interest rate to pin down inflation. In that way, solving the Friedman dilemma. But now, can we not also revisit but what about the Phelps dilemma as we get to the provision or the charging for reserves? Let me think about, so let's start with a case where the banking sector is perfectly competitive. Then, as John Cochrane raised during the questions to Marcus, then if you're trying to charge for the required reserves, you are doing financial repression. And as the literature following Phelps showed, that is inefficient. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that because liquidity is an intermediate good in the banking sector, and therefore you should not be charging for the reserves. John was right at that. But as Marcus partly answered, and so I'll try to elaborate now, banks have market power. If banks have market power, they are monopolist providers of deposits. We know that they seem to pay an interest rate on deposits below the interest on reserves. And as a result, they are monopoly rents. If they are monopoly rents, public finance would say, yes, we should tax the banks. We should extract some of their surplus. They're collecting surplus that you are providing the trains for free or the rail track, and the train company is charging a ticket to people following the monopoly. You should be extracting some of that surplus as a public goods provider. However, if they are monopolists, then the banks are undersupplying deposits and liquidity. If they're undersupplying supplies and liquidity, you shouldn't tax them. You shouldn't under-remunerate required reserves. You should over-remunerate reserves. Because it's by over-remunerating reserves that you solve the monopoly problem that you deal with the sales subsidy. You should pay more. You should pay a bonus to the banks if you think that the problem is the monopoly of the banks. At the same time, and I think Pierre Garincha was the one who raised this in discussion, banks have maybe a limited amount of net worth. And we have many theories saying banks have a limited amount of net worth. They don't issue enough deposits because they wouldn't have enough skin in the game. So even if I set a V very large, they're going to issue too little liquidity. In that case, should you want to tax the banks? No. If they have too little net worth, you want to subsidize the banks. Actually, you want to give them a lump sum transfer, because that's the way in which they're going to create more of the deposits. Again, we're thinking here from the perspective of how do you want to supply the right amount of liquidity as the provider of liquidity in the economy. So both of these say, actually, you want to both give them inframarginally subsidize them and marginally subsidize them even more, the banks, if you're worried about the provision of deposits. So how did Marcus, though, reach this, in his discussion, talked a little bit about the opposite conclusion? Well, the opposite conclusion, actually, they're not opposite, it's just the third side, is you can tier reserves like the Bank of Japan did, and namely, you observe the types of banks that you have. You regulate those banks. Instead of talking about, there's a better solution than subsidizing a monopolist, and that solution, which we've known, Phelps didn't know it, but we've known for 30 years, is to do a two-part tariff. That is, to extract, to price reserves at the margin at the right value, but to try to extract some of the surplus. In other words, you will want, exactly like Marcus, I think, anticipated, you would say, well, I'll charge the reserves at the margin, but I will charge you for that liquidity through a two-part pricing system where I say, here's a fixed payment you have to give me, banks, and here's now you borrow at the interest on reserves. And in some ways, that is what required reserves have done for a long time. However, and then you get to the Marx conclusion, why don't we extract if even all of the surplus, some of the surplus? But let's go a little further. Like Isabel noted, there's a lot of diversity of banks. There's a lot of heterogeneity of banks. There's a lot of heterogeneity of banks, namely because banks have different types in their creation of liquidity. If banks have a lot of creation of liquidity and many different types, you will not be able to do the two-part pricing system because you don't know who's the high revenue and who's the low one. But luckily, this is a mechanism design problem that we know how to solve in economics. This is the Milesian problem of public finance, now applied to central bank provision of liquidity. And what this says is that I do not want to distort at the top the banks that hold lots of reserves. I don't want to charge them anything. I want to pay them the interest on reserves across all of them. And for the other banks, yes, I want to have some potential required reserves, but how much I charge them is, in principle, through a system like the BOJ had, a tiering of reserves that may in itself, not just the required or not, it will depend in general on how exactly some of the surplus you want to extract, but that in general may imply, and here's the tiering that the BOJ does, in the last 10 years that has involved subsidizing the banks. It may as well involve taxing them as it may involve subsidizing them as you think about, as I said, either the monopoly side or the side that you want to extract some of the surplus. That is, if you're trying to think in terms of either revenue or more generally in terms of provision of liquidity, that does require some unconventional policy in terms of thinking of what we pay of interest rates marginally, inframarginally, as well as what should be an overall fee that's collected. But it's actually not obvious that you want to tax them. Another point that came up. Is this equivalent to a tax on the banks? No. Tax on the banks is about extracting profits, but what you're trying to do here is change the supply of liquidity. And so that's why it's instead payment on reserves and or an extraction of a payment system for the public supply of liquidity. To conclude, well, I'm 1 minute over. Conventional inflation policies are to follow a feedback rule for rate of reserves where we measure the state of the economy, calculate an optimal trade-off, and communicate. Crucially in that world is to be aggressive with interest rate policy and have a monetary pillar or an escape clause. Conventional resource policies consist simply of keeping the reserve market satiated, passively satisfying the demand for banknotes, and then, if you hold short-term bonds, you simply distribute the surpluses as dividends, which will keep your net worth constant and small. Unconventional inflation policies involve bounds on interest rates, forward guidance, quantitative easing, and going long, all of which are effective, but also in this, at least under the lights of these the simple model I try to write, show inferior to the conventional inflation policies. Unconventional revenue policies, monetizing the deficits is of course a clear one, risky portfolios a particularly unstable one, I argued. And as for charging the banks through required reserves and tiering, the answer of whether how much you want to charge them or not actually depends, or I framed it the way Milton Friedman would have, not as trying to charge, not as in whether I want to tax them or not, but rather what's the optimal provision of liquidity in a society. And that optimal provision of liquidity is not, the quantity is clear, large enough to satiate, but how do you remunerate those reserves is a problem that does not have an obvious answer and requires a little more attention. Thank you.
Thank you. The discussant is Professor Masazumi Hattori from Hitotsubashi University.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm deeply humbled. Okay. The structure of my discussion is as follows. I briefly summarize the former part of his presentation on inflation determinacy, and I move to transition of BOJ's monetary policies as a country episode. In doing so, I'm going to connect the theory and the episode in Japan. A point to note first, this paper is on determinacy of price level and inflation rate, and he emphasized the necessity of central bank for determinacy. And the paper collects Ricardo's thought on various relevant aspects. My focus is on sections 1 to 3 of the original paper, as agreed in advance, that is on the part of price determinacy, rather than revenue part. Feature of the model is that this is general equilibrium model. All markets are simultaneously in equilibrium. Central bank has a condition, the net worth equal to the present value of its expected deficit. A benchmark model has classical dichotomy between the real and nominal aspect of the economy. Therefore, inflation rate is indeterminate. Okay? So you need two things to add to secure determinacy. That is a kind of friction, that, nominal rigidities in price setting, and central bank. And I'll focus on the feedback rule first. In the central part of the model, he introduced no arbitrage approach. So the household with money arbitrage between the return from real investment and return from reserves at central bank's account. But obviously, households can do it directly. So the banks, financial institutions works for the household. Okay? Then this arbitrage, including, because this arbitrage in real terms, it includes inflation rate elements. Therefore, price exists, current price and future price exist. The Fisher equation directly connect nominal rate, interest rate, and the price level today, and the inflation. And so this is a central thing in his model, arbitrage approach, no arbitrage approach. Feedback rule, okay, typically a Taylor rule, as he stressed, the effectiveness of Taylor rule and all ideas he presented in his paper depends on the degree of agreement between the public and the central bank concerning the state of the economy and the future state of the economy. This is common for all ideas he proposed. Now, feedback rule, this is conceptual phase diagram, two equations, two unknown variables, two equations, Fisher equation, and the policy rule, and two variables, nominal interest rate and inflation rate, 2 and 2, therefore, there is one potential solution. That is the intersection part. That is a potential equilibrium of this economic system. Unfortunately, the intersection has unstable dynamics. Therefore, that means any deviation, small deviation from the intersection leads to further deviation, either upward, downward. There's nothing to prevent it except the terminal condition he explained. In plain English, it means the central bank never allow forward deviation from the intersection. Leaving the feedback rule, the central bank will do something draconic to prevent hyperinflation and hyperdeflation, and the public believe it. The belief pinned down the equilibrium at the only, so the intersection becomes only logical possible equilibrium in this system. That's the logic in new Keynesian model. Adding effectively lower bound, I focus only on the lower side of the phase diagram. Effectively lower bound yield another potential equilibrium. That is called deflation trap with negative inflation rate. And that deflation trap is very stable. Okay? Once the economy reaches there, it's hard to push the economy back to the intersection. That is one reason why the Bank of Japan is still fighting against the zero interest rate. The governor's book was published not 2 years ago, but 2 decades ago. 20 years ago, he was as handsome as now. Yeah? Right. Before the UMP framework, BOJ had a principle of minimum intervention, only in interbank market mainly, only in overnight tenor mainly. Other things are through arbitrages. The BOJ monetary UMP framework went through the sample period. During the period, Japan's economy experienced various shocks, including domestic and international. The first domestic shock was 1997-8 financial system crisis. Chronology from zero interest rate policy to QQE with a negative interest rate and yield curve control. And this spring, BOJ finally resumed the conventional monetary policy. Kudos. Right, coming back to no arbitrage approach, I emphasized it's done by banks. Household cannot do it by themselves. So banks works for the arbitrage. Okay? During the crisis, the first domestic crisis, bank faced binding liquidity and lending, therefore investment capacity constraint. In such a situation, the arbitrage broke down. Okay? Zero interest rate in 1999 can be understood as an attempt to restore the arbitrage. But at the same time, ironically, the equilibrium is transfixed at the deflation trap. Let's see. Japanese banks face so-called Japan premium. That's a premium required for Japanese banks to get finance in interbank market. This is US dollar market, but the same happened in Japanese yen interbank market. The reference is Peak and Rosengren paper. And BOJ deviated from the principle of minimum intervention. BOJ provided a relatively longer liquidity in the interbank market, but it didn't work. What worked was zero interest rate policy. Zero interest rate policy shunned the Japan premium completely, emerging zero interest policy on average in the interbank market. That means not like 2% for one, 8% for one on average 5. No, zero interest rate means without negative territory for nominal interest rate, all have to enjoy zero financing cost. It was very powerful. In terms of scope, BOJ expanded the scope of UMP framework from zero interest rate, long-term rate, risk premium, negative interest rate, inflation expectation management. The aims of the UMP framework can be summarized in these 3 bullet points. First, reduction in financing costs in nominal terms by suppressing risk premium. Second, what I call expectation big push. Okay? So BOJ wanted to move the equilibrium to the intersection by pushing the Fisher equation upward. Okay? Coordination, focal point, strategic complementarity, supermodularity, global game, what's your name? BOJ counted on it. Reduction in real interest rate. That is the third one, but important point is the real interest rate vis-a-vis natural rate of interest. Okay, they are different, And the comparison matters, and as in the recent speech by the Governor Weather at the beginning of this month. You have seen this many times. So what's the effect of a fall in real interest rate? Okay, that is here, shorter distance between the two potential equilibria. Okay? Even if the Bank of Japan immediately detects a reduction in real interest rate and adjust the policy function, the distance between the two, so this case, this is the immediate action case. Okay? Even in such a case, the distance between the potential equilibria becomes shorter. This is what the Japan's economy experienced. Another experience through the sample period was, again, famous aging economy. It's known, and it's no surprise anymore. Prime Minister Kishida announced a comprehensive measure to tackle the problem, but it was announced just last year. Before the last year, the government had been very optimistic. So the projection of the future population had been overshooting the reality. The green line is the forecast of total fertility rate, blue line is the actual data. Last year, figure will have 1.2, the historical low. I interpret as news shock. Okay? Demographic forecast can be interpreted as news. News in macroeconomics means an event in the future, known now. Okay? Demographic forecasts were revised down successfully. That means negative shock to news successfully. Okay? It has two-sided effect through supply side or demand side. Being in Japan, listening to economists, Bank of Japan, our perception of the effect seems to be through the demand side. If we accept it through the new Keynesian Phillips curve, the shock is a successive shocks, deflationary shocks to the economy year after year. That was the second phenomenon. So what about inflation expectations in Japan? It had never stabilized. It had never been stabilized around 2%. One recommendation is this one. Please refer to this, Japan's monetary policy database created by my research colleague and friend, Professor Joichi Nakajima. A feature of the inflation expectations in Japan is reported as backward-looking to a considerable extent. Okay? Therefore, the BOJ did a lot of effort for inflation target, setting the inflation target at 2%, elaborate on the strategy, elaborate on the timelines, but BOJ, because of this backward-looking element, BOJ have to walk the walk in tandem with talk the talk. Forward guidance puzzle, this was mentioned by Ricardo, and the prime suspect as a cause for the forward guidance puzzle in Japan is the backward inflation expectations. And the other two facts, decreasing trend of potential growth rate and the successive shock to news concerning demographic changes, could be other suspect as a cause of forward guidance puzzle in Japan. On Fisher equation, briefly, sometimes there's a confusion when we understand what's Fisher equation. In macroeconomics literature, this is kind of an extreme neo-Fisherian approach. So if you want to have a higher expected inflation rate, you should raise nominal interest rate. Okay? That can be an implication from their idea. But in dialogue delivered by central bank, real interest rate, okay, in the financial market, in actual real interest rate can be variable. And if the expected inflation rate goes up, real interest rate goes down. But it's understandable that the former focus on steady state, long-run steady state. The central bank focus on business cycle management. Ricardo referred to good idea that using excess reserve, I think excess reserve mostly, to determine inflation, even over one period. Okay? But he also explained it's a dangerous way. But in my understanding, central bank cannot determine kind of maturity of excess reserve. I introduced the concept, the maturity. So you don't know until when excess reserve exists, right? If we discuss maturity of excess reserve, my reading is that it's effectively equivalent to effective period with excess reserve set by forward guidance or commitment in UMP. Okay? Therefore, issues discussed concerning forward guidance commitment are applicable. Finally, policy rule management in theory. Rightly, he emphasized how important estimations are, right? Accurate estimations are very important, right? That is true in this case in response to a reduction in real interest rate. If the central bank immediately detect it and adjust the policy rule, the central bank can restore the target inflation rate. It's possible. It's easy to say, but it's hard to do, right? That is, estimations are what central banks are doing every day on the earth, right? In an interview program that I happened to watch in New York on a business trip, an interviewer asked Alan Greenspan then, Chairman Greenspan, could you explain your job in a way that the ordinary people like my grandmother can understand? And his answer was, my job is constant Bayesian updating. And the interviewer said, I don't think my grandmother can understand it, right? But he was fair, definitely. He was definitely fair, right? Beside their terminology, right? Okay, concluding remark, this paper is a theory paper. My discussion was mostly from the empirics in Japan. My emphasis on empirics does not mean I'm belittling theory, because theory is the backbone for central banks' practices to base on. References, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hattori. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to accumulate some questions before I ask you to respond. Now you can move your nameplates in upright position if you have a question. Okay, Professor Brunemeyer.
Very nice lecture. I just have two quick questions. One is, you have this structure where you have a shocking period from 0 to 1, and then it's constant. Can you elaborate a little bit, what do we lose by having the constant, no uncertainty subsequently, because there might be a subsequent shocks which made things worse, or things like that, or is it out of loss of generality, or just to balance on this? And then the concept of liquidity is very much driven by this convenience yield. Is this a broad enough concept of liquidity to consider? Or is there more to liquidity? And of course, when you do a mechanism design, it's more complicated if you have firms providing it with financial constraints. So this makes it a much more challenging mechanism design problem. And perhaps you can elaborate on this. Why do you want to outsource it to the private sector then? Why don't you provide it by the public sector altogether? Of course, I'm not arguing to do that, but just a theoretical exercise.
Okay, Dr. Jordan.
Thank you, Ricardo, for this really interesting paper and presentation. I have a question regarding the principle of satiation with bank reserves. If you deviate and go back to the old principle that there is a structural deficit for banks, so that they have to go to the central bank in order to get the liquidity. So in a way that, if I understood your model correct, that would mean that there is no remuneration on reserves, and the convenience yield on reserves would then be equal to the nominal interest rate, the short-term interest rate. What would be the implication of your results on monetary policy and any other implication of that?
Okay, Doctor, is that Charles' nameplate I'm seeing there, or? Oh. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, no, thanks. I just want to level set my own understanding or thoughts about quantitative easing in the context of this analysis and Marcus's paper. If you never hit the effective lower bound as a central banker, would you want to do quantitative easing? Is that really a tool that you would be using? I mean, if I go back to like 2007 when the Fed had $800 billion, you know, in their SOMA account, and if you set it with all the interest on reserves considerations and things like that, and then you never hit the effective lower bound, we wouldn't really want to be doing QE, would we, or would we? That's sort of the question. In the context of your analyses.
Okay, let's hear your response, Professor Reis.
Hello. Okay. So let me give a few answers. First, starting with discussion. Thank you very much for that discussion, and especially for clarifying many of the things that I didn't explain well. One substantive point that you make is that certainly in the transmission of monetary policy, I talk always of you set an interest rate, and then it is the forces of arbitrage or of allocation, if you want, of savings that lead to the price level becoming determined. But as you well put it, only banks can hold reserves, and therefore banks are the transmitters of the monetary policy. That in turn, by the way, feeds back into our discussion of remuneration of reserves, because this feeds back into the transmission of monetary policy. It's not that the banks are the ones doing the arbitrage, to the extent to which the interest rates they set on their loans and all of the other assets, to what extent they mimic that interest rate. And so one consideration of the many more on the remunerating reserves is that subject to wanting to provide that liquidity and subject to wanting to that liquidity be provided in an optimal way, which involves all of the mechanism design problems, there's also the fact that, which was the first 20 minutes of the presentation, of course, that at the margin, though, you want to set your interest on reserves in a way that shifts all the other interest rates equiproportionally, because that would be the ideal transmission. Insofar as it's never going to be equiproportional, that is another consideration of exactly how you move that and how you set the structure of the remuneration reserves, and then the banks become important in that transmission through those reserves. Second point, Marcus on the one period in the uncertainty, obviously something is lost, as with all assumptions. I think for the points I was making in terms of how conventional monetary policy works and how unconventional monetary policy works, I think many of, by revealed preference, I thought many of the points were not lost. I think some of the things that get lost is this distinction between when it comes to the unconventional policies, not just I bought long-term Verns versus short, but the difference between the 2-year and the 5-year and buying some particular, and on the uncertainty, it's not so much the permanent, is the extent to which you can exploit risk premium. And so the whole risk channel of monetary policy, as for instance in your model with Yuli Sannikov, that gets lost. So there's a loss of those dimensions, which I refer you to your paper to understand how this works. But among a few others on the risk channel of importance. Very important is this issue of liquidity, absolutely. So that is a very, I define liquidity I discuss liquidity in terms of convenience yield. It's a very powerful way to discuss liquidity in the same way that risk, thinking of risk in terms of stochastic discount factors is a very powerful way to doing it and one gets very far, but it comes with those limitations. And so as you're thinking about either affecting the amount of liquidity to affect inflation, or the way in which you want to provide public liquidity and then the way that intermediates with private liquidity, as you're thinking about other dimensions of liquidity provision, they will absolutely affect the analysis in terms of how you think that this will work. Now, insofar as you keep the interest on reserves as being your monetary policy tool, and you keep the amount of reserves satiated or close to it, then note that as you've eliminated the liquidity on the reserves, well, your use of the interest on reserves to target inflation is not affected by the other forms of liquidity. So it becomes crucial exactly that you do it that way. If you live in a scarce reserve, and that feeds into Thomas's question, if you live in a scarce reserves system, then you have the issue that you have multiple tranches of policy. They're not being transmitted only through the interest rate, but also because the quantity of reserves are affecting, for instance, going back to monetary history, the quantity of credit in the economy in ways that affect liquidity in the way Marcus would be describing it. And monetary policy becomes more complicated in that sense because it works with those extra channels. And that, I think, becomes a limitation in the view of what I called conventional. You may call it as a strength insofar as it becomes now an unconventional more channel through the quantity of liquidity and therefore the provision of credit beyond the interest rate on liquidity because of that satiation. And so that allows me to fit into your question. Then, on Charlie's question, I mean, the point I made was that outside of the ELB, QE is inferior to setting interest rate to the satiated reserve system. That was basically my conclusion, if you want, insofar as QE. But it was but I got there not through listing all possible inconvenience or not, but by saying QE is potentially a way to not use the feedback rule or the Taylor rule. Let me write a model in which you could use QE to target inflation perfectly in an ideal world. Having started from that, I could then see, so starting from at least writing a model where it's feasible for QE to pin down inflation, is this better or worse than using a feedback rule? And the model screamed and said the reason why it is inferior is because, one, the transition of QE to inflation has parameters that require an enormous amount of QE and volatility. So instead of plus minus 25 basis points, it would be plus minus 10 billion of QE, was the conclusion. Even more than 10 billion. We're talking about hundreds of billions of QE, and that is always a limitation. And second, that the shocks to the convenience yield, or the shock to the demand for bonds, would translate, unless you were to offset them perfectly, would translate to massive fluctuations in inflation. And so those are the 2 points on why it was. But to understand, but for me to be able to get those, I have to write a model first where QE could do it, to then conclude that QE is not a good way of doing it, if that makes sense. So that was the logical exercise that I made.
So that's going to be a little bit like Poole's famous.
Yes, exactly. So that's exactly the point I was making. Exactly.
Okay, let's take 3 more questions quickly. Professor Greenshaw.
Yes, thank you. So I thought this was really excellent. I guess I have one question, and it's mostly about one comment and one question about the last part where you talk about, from inflation to revenues. I mean, so first, I'm still sort of struggling a little bit about thinking about central banks trying to generate revenues, and as that being fiscal or non-fiscal. I mean, I think you said you don't want to think of it as fiscal, but I'm not exactly sure I see why. The monetization example is very clear that somehow it's a substitute for fiscal, but I think even if you're trying to sort of play with the fluctuations in the net worth of the central bank because you're trying to guarantee some flow payments to the government, I think that's still fiscal in a sense. But where it brings a question to me is I thought the part on the remuneration of reserves and how you want to subsidize maybe the banks because they are under providing liquidity. So would it be fair to say that if you move to a system where the central bank can directly provide the liquidity, let's say a retail central bank digital currency, that problem is gone? That somehow you can directly target the optimal amount of liquidity, and that, and if you were to move in that direction, in the context, I'm not sure your model is really set up to answer that, but it would seem that in your model you definitely want to do that, and so then the question is, what do we need the banks for? Thanks.
Okay, Dr. Garriga.
Well, thank you, Ricardo, for a very insightful presentation. Just a quick thing. I'm looking at the time constraints, so hopefully we don't hit the bound. But maybe you have solved the case of credit allocation in your paper, and maybe you haven't had time to discuss it. But as you well know, in 2008, one of the policies was purchase MBS to kind of lift up the housing market, and that was kind of an ex-post policy. And then we kind of used the Fed, the playbook in 2020 ex-ante to prevent a housing meltdown. And there were some critics that they pointed out that when you have the price of a 10-year bond trading at par with 30-year MBS, maybe you went too far with the credit allocation. So from your perspective, how we could use your framework to, in terms of quantitative easing to try to understand those credit allocation interventions. I suspect that may have kind of a feedback loop into the real economy, but at least at a very basic level, is that a good idea, bad idea? We understand that, as you responded to Charlie, that, these are suboptimal policies relative to conventional policies, but, if you could rank them, should you just avoid credit allocation? Thank you.
Dr. Rain.
Many thanks for excellent presentations. I have a question concerning policy and its communication, starting from the assumption which was in the presentation that the effectiveness of the rule depends on the public's agreeing with the central bank's view of the current and future state of the economy. And as we learned from Dr. Hattori's comment, Japan has pursued unconventional monetary policy of several forms over years, over the past quarter of a century, and expanded its toolkit with quite limited impact on inflation dynamics, apparently. So this could suggest that different policy rules or several policy rules actually bring the same result. But it may also suggest that the economy does not see or the public does not see the consecutive changes in the conduct of monetary policy as meaningful rule changes or consequential rule changes. And as long as the central bank is broadly seen as independent, the economy or the public may believe in a stable price regime. So I wonder, what is your view on this potential discrepancy and the relationship between policy objectives and its link to communication? Thank you.
Professor Reich.
Very good. Let me start with purely Vigorinches. On the fiscal, not fiscal, let me just clarify why there's nothing wrong calling it fiscal, and it is fiscal. But let me just clarify why I'm trying to stay away from the term. And so let me use an analogy, which I think is useful for this question, which is we provide train tracks in many countries, public train tracks. Then we have train operators run on those trains. Okay? Now, insofar as we are providing train tracks, the optimal amount of train track, we'd figure out how many rail to put down on the ground. We could have figured out what that is, and then just apply it for free and say, well, whomever wants to use it can use it for free. Insofar as we charge for people to use the rail that we have put, we, the government, we are fiscal and then we're collecting fiscal revenue. Yes. But when I'm trying to figure out what is the optimal amount that I want to charge for use of the train tracks, I wouldn't call it a fiscal question insofar as I'm just trying to set it so that people internalize the marginal cost that it took for society to do that. So is it fiscal? Absolutely. It's about revenues. At the same time, it's not with the goal of maximizing seniorage. That was my transition from the choice to the other. It was simply to implement the Samuelson-Ramsey rule of the optimal public provision. And that's why I even end up at the end as maybe you actually end up paying more than you receive once you do the combination of subsidy and that. So that's the simple reason why I was called fiscal. The goal is not to maximize. The goal is simply to engage in the optimal provision. And on here, I feel in very safe ground because I'm following in the footsteps of Milton Friedman, who also asked, what's the optimal supply of money? And ended up never answered that question, but simply telling you, how much should you charge for that money? I have an interest rate of 0. Because if you're trying to think about the optimal supply, you end up saying, well, how much should the government charge for it? And in his case, it was just the opportunity cost. That leads to your great question on CBDC. So imagine we had CBDC. Absolutely, you're right. In a sense, the problem becomes easier because, well, if I can supply this, if there's problems with how these intermediaries are supplying the deposits, I can just charge the right amount, which in this case will be just the marginal cost of producing reserves. Then maybe it will have, instead of requiring reserves, simple. For people, if you deposit central bank, I'll make the interest on reserves be a certain amount. For the banks, I'll charge another amount. That's the tiering now that I have, depending on who that is. And maybe that's a beautiful way of solving the problem. You ask, what's wrong with that? Well, why do we need the banks at all? This is where I go back to my train track supplier. If if I set out the train tracks, why doesn't the government just run the train company? Well, I think we would say because maybe the government is not very good at running train companies, won't be able to supply them in all the right ways, and that's why I have a private sector. Likewise, I would say that's why we have the private banks, because I don't think the BOJ or the ECB or the Fed are particularly going to offer all the variety of deposits and services that come associated with them. And once they do, then you have to realize how much do I charge for the train tracks, for the liquidity, for then the banks to offer all that combination of services. Then comes the types that Isabel was raising and how to formulate that. And that's the questions that I was trying to go after. Carlos Garriga, on the credit allocation. So in terms of, I just, again, a little bit like in my answer to Charlie Evans, but just to clarify the little I was doing, or maybe the too much that I was doing, I was asking, if all I want is to pin down inflation, here's a bunch of alternative ways of doing them. In all of them, it will work. Let me then see the trade-offs relative to a benchmark, which is what I call the traditional one. So when it comes to credit allocation, there were two ways in which that would work to pin down inflation. One would be, it's just another convenience yield. Therefore, it would just be another asset in the same way that I talked about quantitative easing buying a scarce bond. It could be any other thing the MBS would work. When it comes to your thinking of not even a government bond, but a more, let's call it narrow or further from pure financial asset, when it involves credit allocation, you would think that the objections that I raised with Charlie, the fact that the transmission of this and how volatile it is, would be even bigger, which makes it somewhat inferior. I also mentioned towards the end an alternative, which that I very much underexplored, which is the one you noted, which is what if these policies affect what I call the R, the state of the economy directly, and in doing so, I would use those to affect inflation. Those seem particularly costly because, of course, you're distorting choices in order to pin down inflation. That's why I really like my setup where I say take the real as given and then just pin down inflation without trying to distort the real to get to the inflation. But certainly that would be a tool. I would argue that one is particularly inefficient or insufficient. And then Ollie Wren's very good question. Within a regime, once one has a very stable regime, what I call, say, the conventional one, then the communication, as I said, is about aligning the central bank with the central bank's perceptions with the public's ones. Or I think there is an insight that I think the equations make clear, and is an insight that is fortified, that is confirmed by the literature, which is the insight of, in some ways, when you set a nominal interest rate, and agents are choosing how much to consume and spend, what prices to set, as important as whether you're right is whether your expectations are aligned with theirs. Because if your expectations are aligned with theirs, they're not going to engage in the consumption and the savings. They're not going to engage in the real versus nominal choices that would in principle lead to an inflation aside from target. So the communication is very much about this coordination game. And that coordination game goes to the heart of the indeterminacy of the price level. The key result in inflation is ultimately that the price level is indeterminate. Once we agree on what yesterday we were calling the social norm of what inflation should be, and the expectations are anchored in that way, any inflation is as good as another one, and we will anchor it that way. However, and you noted very astutely, as I was discussing the different regimes, the unconventional regimes, and I was laying out how each one of them pins down inflation, if we have a central bank that alternates between them, then, of course, our stock expectations within each regime. Once we start saying, a little bit along the lines of Sophocles' earlier presentation, that now I don't know which regime I'm in, and in the nonlinear VAR, the agents themselves don't know which regime they're in, then all of them's credibility gets undermined. So, surely, if you think that you can always engage in conventional policy, you should even discuss the unconventional one, because all you'll be doing is unsteering expectations. Now, of course, the last 10 years show us that sometimes you need to go into the unconventional and use those in some ways, but it does come with a cost, which is whenever you engage in unconventional policy, which is, I think, the way I would frame your question in terms of my framework, is whenever you engage in conventional policy, you are ultimately anchoring some expectations because you're relying on different channels that will harm your conventional policy. And I think the forward guidance example I gave is a very simple and clear example of that happening.
Thank you, Professor Reis and Professor Hattori. This concludes session 4.